Here's Brody Brazil.
So likely by now, you've already heard about this White Sox ballpark project and what they're hoping to do at this site called the 78, which would be Chicago's 78th neighborhood if they actually ever get to developing it. It's kind of amazing that this property, this piece of land, actually exists where it does, because the renderings for it now that were actually leaked a couple weeks ago, but have since been officially republished, like it turns out the leaks were pretty accurate. These designs have been updated and improved, it seems, in a few different ways, but generally speaking, this is what we saw leak out a couple weeks ago. And these images, like I said, are just breathtaking. Look at the skyline of Chicago. We're in the South Loop here. We're just south of downtown. We're just west of Lake Michigan. We're only about 2.5 miles north of the current ballpark, and we'll talk about Guaranteed Rate Field in just a second, but what a world of difference this would be in moving out of a neighborhood that the White Sox have only ever known to come up just a little bit closer to downtown Chicago, your riverfront here in Chicago. What could be better than that? And you keep some of the traditions, the pinwheels, the fireworks out in center field, but if you open up that center field area, you get an impressive look at the skyline. I'm still going to call it Sears Tower. I know it's Willis Tower off to the left, but all of that right at the forefront. I mean, it's close to get to, but it's easy to look at if you're sitting behind the infield at this new ballpark. And what a majestic rendering this is. Again, I think renderings here in 2024 are getting so good, so realistic, giving you an accurate depiction of what this might look like. And again, I think as much as the design is modern and simplistic and tasteful, I think the location is probably the biggest sell of all this. I mean, there's a train stop, not an L stop, not too far away. But the idea of taking a water taxi to a White Sox game is so amazing, and I think that picture right there spells it out the best. Now, if this happens, right, there are a couple big points to consider. This would arguably put two of Major League Baseball's best venues in the exact same market. This is crazy, right, to think about Wrigley Field, its tradition, its legacy, its history, and how they've recently actually upgraded it to modern standards. You get Wrigley in the north, and you get this beautiful new White Sox ballpark on the south side of Chicago. And so of all the dual markets that MLB has between Los Angeles and New York and Chicago and the Bay Area, I mean, none of them could really compete venue-wise with what Chicago could have. So in my opinion, two of MLB's best facilities in the exact same city, that would be so unique. There's also this, which I don't know if many people have talked about yet. North Clark Street runs right up to Wrigley Field, and South Clark Street, literally the same street, just several miles apart, they actually connect Wrigley Field with this 78 site. And so think of all the elements there of the rivalry in Chicago, the Clark Street controversy, the Clark Street clash. I don't know what it is yet, but they'll come up with something. How cool is that? I mean, not only would they be two of the best ballparks in baseball for different reasons, right? One historic, one new and modern, and both in great, cool locations, but they're literally on essentially the same street in Chicago. As I mentioned before, it also would move the White Sox a critical 2.5 miles approximately closer to downtown. And location has always been kind of an issue, a question, even with the old Comiskey Park where it was at, not a big deal to get to. And I understand the history, more than 100 years. Basically, the old ballpark was right across the street. They built the new one on the south side of that road. So the White Sox have never been really anywhere else. For people in Chicago, this is a huge move. It's 2.5 miles. That's a big deal. They're taking the White Sox out of the only neighborhood they've ever known. But in the big picture, realistically, so good for the fans, so good for the city of Chicago to get something like this. And as you saw in the renderings before, it could provide one of the best skyline views in all of baseball looking at downtown. There's also this from the Chicago Sun-Times, more details about the old facility, right? Used to be called New Comiskey, used to be called U.S. Cellular Field. Now it's called Guaranteed Rate Field. Were there any other names in there in between? I've lost track. That facility is still $50 million in debt, which is owed by the Illinois Sports Facility Agency. It's a public entity, meaning that the public and the government owe $50 million to still pay off that stadium, which opened up in 1991. So that's unfortunate, but it's also part of why they want to use it for a future different purpose, which I'm about to spell out here. Now, the developer Related Midwest, they're the ones in charge of that site, those the 78, the 60-plus acres at the 78. Don't get that confused. But they recently had a pretty high-level meeting with the Chicago White Sox about getting this done. They have apparently, going back to the old site, the Guaranteed Rate Field site, 1,300 residences planned for the Bridgeport current site where the White Sox play in what they want to redevelop there. And going back to the 78 location for just a second, they're saying it's a $9 billion investment. They say it's going to create 22,000 jobs, and it's going to have 1,000 units of affordable housing at the new site. So again, the old site, 1,300 residences. The new site, 1,000 units alone of affordable housing in addition to what they're saying is 22,000 jobs. It's way more than just a ballpark at the 78 site. They really are getting into that whole ballpark village type situation. Speaking of Guaranteed Rate Field, this is what they're thinking it might look like after some renovations. They want to turn it into apparently a soccer facility, use some of that land to the north, the south. The north is to the left here. The south is to the right of your screen here. There's the Dan Ryan Expressway to the east, which is on the top of the image. I know, it's all confusing. But this is an idea of what they want to do to the ballpark in repurposing this neighborhood. They don't want to leave it high and dry. They want to make use of a facility that's only, about 30-plus years old, and could use some love and some reconfiguration and to get some second use out of that facility. But speaking of Guaranteed Rate Field, I also want to show you this. It's always been kind of amazing to me that downtown exists off into the distance, and there is this view and perspective that you could have, but only if the ballpark actually, faced that way and was open a bit more to the north. Now, I totally understand that ballparks usually face east, and you don't want to have the batter's eye facing the sun, so you wouldn't point it west, and you don't really need to here, but even if you turn it around just a little bit, maybe 90 or 130 degrees to the left, like counterclockwise here, you could have a ballpark that would kind of face north and would have some view out there of the Chicago skyline. And just to be clear, this is where old Comiskey Park was, right across the street. This is where they built the new one. And this is very much on the south side of Chicago. By the way, this is the Dan Ryan Expressway. This is how a lot of White Sox fans get to the game. They also take the L, which is the train embedded right in between the north and southbound lanes here. I also want to point this out as we go visit the 78 site. If you follow these tracks here up north, and there are a couple stations in between the current ballpark and the potential future site, this is the 78 right here. And if you can kind of see right here, those L tracks, they go underground. They're not elevated anymore. They're subterranean at this point. But you would have to imagine that you could take those train tracks right there and put some kind of station here, maybe an underground station for the train that could be utilized by this 78 site. But speaking of the site, here it is in all its glory. And it just, again, it's amazing that a property like this with so much acreage that's riverfront, it's got a few things. It's got some other train lines and rail lines running through it, so you have to work around that. But it's so viable, and it's so doable from a sense of building not only a stadium but other amenities to go along with it. Now, I also talked before about the potential arrival to a game via water taxi, and I mean, just follow the river here up downtown and how interconnected everything is from so many different angles. Whoa, I'm kind of getting dizzy looking at this, but obviously, the heart of downtown Chicago here and what opens up to Lake Michigan, yeah, you go under a bunch of those bridges and you get down here a little bit to the south. You're in the South Loop. All of a sudden, yeah, you put some type of dock or marina situation, and you could easily have a fair amount, I don't want to say a lot, of White Sox fans coming by boat, but what a cool way to arrive at a game at this potential stadium. So it's got a lot going for it. I realize that there are some high-level negotiations happening right now to secure the future of this site. It's by no means a guarantee, but this just seems like such an optimal situation for the city of Chicago if this can turn into a reality from what right now is just a possibility. You've made it here to the end of the video. You know I appreciate that. Thumbs up down below. That'll greatly help me and the channel and help reach you next time, possibly. And on that note, make sure before you leave here subscribe to this channel so I can definitely see you back here next time.